Evening, everybody. Prananda. Welcome to this Welsh section event, which has been very kindly organised by Charlotte, who is our new Welsh section member of the team. So the Welsh section is a group of volunteer SAIM members who work together to organise events and activities that are particular to Wales and the Welsh section. This evening's event, although a Welsh section event, is not going to be entirely Welsh section because we've got folks that work across Wales. We do obviously have Richard, who is joining us, who's a big member of the Welsh community, and Ian does do some activities and stuff in Wales as well. So the sections, so the event this evening is focusing on the not original back guidelines, the back guidelines and the update on the back guidelines, which happened 2023. Hopefully I'm right on that. And we've basically been working on these guidelines, working to these guidelines, and the event is going to focus on sort of the experience that have come about in terms of the delivery of the guidelines. So I'll introduce Ian and Richard shortly, but I am asked to remind you that the next event, the Welsh section event, which sounds really exciting as well, is going to be on the white-tailed egret. Eagle. Oh gosh, invented a new species there. White-tailed eagle, which will be the 15th of January. Hopefully I've got that date right. And then Richard's also asked me to remind everyone that there's a planning event. So the English modifications to the English planning bill that are happening. And I've forgotten the date, but Mandy's going to very kindly put that in the chat. So just a reminder, a number of Welsh section events going on. And if you have any ideas for events, would like to participate in events, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Mandy or to Charlotte, who's on the call, or the wider Welsh section. Or indeed, if you want to get involved in the wider Welsh section, please don't hesitate to ask. Right then, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ian and Richard this evening. To speak to us. So Ian is a highly experienced ecologist providing professional ecological advice since 1996. I don't believe that, it's too young for that. And Ian specialises in protected species and habitat management with extensive experience in consultancy. Ian is recognised as a leading bat specialist, holding multiple licences since 1995, and has managed complex surveys and research on most UK bat species for major infrastructure and housing projects. Ian's PhD investigated the ecology of pipistrelle bats, and he's led research into ecology of tree roosting bat species. Ian's expertise is in ecological assessment, legal frameworks, and species licensing, or has also seen him act as an expert witness at public inquiries. And Ian's very kindly joining us from New Zealand this evening. And one thing he has said is that there's some helicopters potentially about to take off in the background. So if there is an interruption, bear with, we'll let the helicopters take off and then we'll reconvene again. Right, over to Richard now. So Richard is a highly respected bat ecologist with over 26 years of professional experience. These days, he focuses on helping other ecologists tackle tricky bat issues and develops their skills through training and advice. He also runs the Team Bat membership platform and is co-organizer of the Ecology Expo, which is taking place in March 2026. That sounds like it's going to be an amazing event as well. Richard is recently accredited at level 3 under Natural England's Bat Earned Recognition scheme, and Richard has 15 sites so far covering 14 species. Wow, coverage. He's a chartered environmentalist, a fellow of the Linnaean Society, and joined Bat Conservation Trust's Batty Hall of Fame in 2022. Right, I don't think I need to say any more. We've got two amazing speakers this evening. They're going to speak for sort of about 20 minutes each. I think we're going to have some questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Ian's going to kick off, and then Richard. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Harry. And yes, sorry, I'm just in case my signal drops for 10 seconds. Every now and again, it seems to be dropping out. Just very shortly, I'm in the middle of Fiordland National Park in New Zealand doing some work on bats. It's morning here. You can just see the light gaining some traction, and I've just been processing some bats just before it became light. One thing I'm not used to, I'm afraid, is Zoom, and I can't for the life of me find my share screen again. So I'm going to just stop sharing, and I'll share it again so we can crack on with this talk. So my talk, there you go, I found it, is really about a part of the guidelines. So although I've been working with Richard and many others on the past few editions, the past couple of editions of the bat survey guidelines, and I was the author of chapter 9, or the primary author of chapter 9, which is advanced survey techniques. Most people probably don't really look at this section that much because it's relatively specialist, but it may, with the new changes, particularly in England, around how we do surveys or assessments or whatever they might end up being, perhaps more important. And I'll give you some examples in this talk as to why. Like Richard, I'm also ER and level 3 and trees and woodlands and all that sort of stuff. And I've got two businesses. So one in the UK with a team based in Bristol, and I head back most summers and to the UK, but I live in New Zealand and we've got a business here. So I'm just doing some work here in Fiordland National Park, and I was working on these little fellas, these short-tailed bats, over the last few nights. So my talk's really going to talk about what are advanced survey methods, so people understand that. A bit about what the current guidelines say about them, and haven't changed too much since the 2016 guidelines, and how they've been used, in some case studies, really just to sort of, I guess, tickle people's interest or understanding around how these have been used, and I guess the benefits and some of the cons around them as well, because there's always two sides to every coin. And we've got some residential major infrastructure and some strategic planning examples to give, and also including some forest woodland management ash dieback examples too. So why do we need to use advanced survey methods? This was actually one I got AI to do based on a cartoon I saw somewhere about finance and economy and predicting shares. I mean, there's an element of what we do is a bit like that. I mean, there's only so much you can do with a static log or a transect survey in a bat detector, and I'll talk about that why. I'm not saying we get into wild speculation, but we do, and we all do it. I've done it. You know, you sometimes feel obliged to sort of say something's happening when the evidence isn't really there. And I think, you know, working off of evidence is really important. You might have presence of something, you might not quite sure what species it is. You certainly won't know what breeding status it is. But it's amazing what stories can be told from, you know, some bat passes on a bat detector. And I think, you know, we sometimes need to be cautious about how we do that. But advanced surveys can be the solution to that. This involves generally trapping free-flying bats using devices such as harp traps or mist nets, as here. The use of lures in particular has made that job a lot easier. When I started out, there were no lures. In the early 2000s, I started using lures, and my catch rate started increasing to a point where you could actually, not guarantee, but you could have a really good chance, a much better chance than not, of getting the bats you needed to meet a particular survey objective. And then the final sort of stage, if that's part of the project, is to radio track bats and to find out where they're roosting and how they're sort of moving around the landscape. Why do we do it? Well, there are some species that you just don't detect as much using traditional methods. So, and again, I'm not talking about necessarily roost surveys as such, but obviously I'll come on to tree roosts in a minute. Long-eared bats, Bechstein's bats, are really under-recorded. And although barbastels are actually relatively straightforward to pick up, I suspect they're more under-recorded than we think, because they tend to use lower amplitude calls, particularly when they're foraging, which is why a lot of people don't have a lot of feeding buzzes from barbastels. And on a couple of projects, and these are referred to in the guidelines, you know, one over 6 months, I think they only picked up 6 long-ear calls. But the capture surveys made up 41% of the actual bat captures, and the most regularly captured bat. So, you know, we've got an issue really that we tend to sort of lump bats all in the same place, but some bats are probably not, or don't receive a great service from us if we're just doing acoustic work or visual work. We also caught 3 Bechstein bats on that particular project when they were relatively unexpected. So just for rare species, well, you know, yes and no. So Annex 2 species, the 4 here that we have regularly occurring and breeding in the UK. Yes, you know, advanced surveys for those may be more important if you're affecting perhaps a designated site nearby or an important population. Or in the case of Bechsteins or Barbastels, you actually need to know where they're actually roosting, which is, really quite important in many respects. But it's not just about the rare ones. I mean, we've got 6 species of Myotis here on this slide, 7 if you include the greater mouse-eared bat, and all their calls overlap. And in the case of Bechsteins, it's quite a quiet bat, so you may not even record it. Even if you do have a Myotis call, it may not be a Bechstein just because you can't hear it that much. And the other bats, I mean, I know there are lots of AI, but a lot of that hasn't been tested. And every time scientists do surveys or do monitoring and some sort of testing of it, they come back with the same answer, really. You can be confident to a point, but is that confidence level high enough? Is it important enough, I suppose, to determine between them? And our company, and I see many companies out there, just tend to lump all these, when acoustically lump all these things into Myotis, unless perhaps you get an observation of the Daubenton's or something along those lines, over some water. So it's just very difficult to be certain about those things. And now we're sort of looking at assemblages in a more objective way with the bat mitigation guidelines, sort of stuff on that. Then, it's important that we perhaps know what species we're dealing with. Also quite important, the difference, ecological value of breeding bats, non-breeding bats, males versus females is quite important. If you've got a woodland with a breeding colony in it, sort of that status is a much higher than perhaps one without. And so getting that kind of information is also very, very important to do an accurate evaluation. So that's why, we use advanced survey techniques for certain situations. And fundamentally, if anybody's sort of been reading up on this principle called the roost resource concept, that came about out of a lot of my work I'd been doing in the 2000s on Bechsteins and Barbastels, and realizing that, they're using a lot of different roosts over a very short space of time. And the law doesn't talk about individual trees being protected, or a roost. The law talks about breeding sites, and here's a breeding site for a Barbastel. It's actually all those dots in all those woods. That's, in my view, arguably, an important part of this. So it's actually understanding how the bats are using woodlands, not just individual trees. There can be an obsession with individual maybe a week, and then they're using lots of others. We just haven't found them yet. And many of you will obviously be aware now with the new guidelines and the interim guidance from BCT about using night vision aids. Well, that actually came out of some research that we did. Well, certainly the evidence, there was talk of doing it for some time, but the evidence we managed to provide is that on average, if you looked across the entire species, entire roost range in every habitat, most people, well, all people that were doing our surveys and our monitoring couldn't see bats on average 8 minutes after you couldn't see the feature anymore. So that led to those changes there. So what sort of projects do we think of then with advanced surveys? Well, it really depends on the question, I suppose, because I guess a lot of the projects we operate on as professional ecologists come under these anyway. Do we need confidence in species? Perhaps we're in an area where Bechsteins occur, and the guidelines quite specifically say you should really be doing trapping if you're going to affect potential Bechsteins habitat. That's a bit of a hit and miss affair, in my opinion. I've seen plenty of surveys out there right next to colonies I've been studying in Hampshire, for instance, and not far from Havant, and Bechsteins aren't even mentioned except in a data search. And they find these records of Bechsteins, but then don't proceed to do Bechstein surveys, even though they're affecting habitat next door. So, you end up looking bad because people like me call you out, and, it's in the guidelines, why aren't you applying? Landscape level projects, radio tracking in particular is very useful for this. And, finding roosts in those landscapes, not just in trees but also in buildings, can be quite valuable so your site can be sort of put into context. And I guess fundamentally, because there's some downsides to advanced surveys, high impact projects is where I suggest that advanced surveys should be seriously considered, because there's some potentially major changes in the landscape, and these could have some drastic effects on bats, and you may not even know with standard survey techniques what sort of impact you're having. There are plenty of pros. For instance, it's way more effective if you've got hundreds of trees. You can put in small specialist teams. You can get a huge amount of useful data. And when I say useful data, I'm not saying that other data is not useful, but things like breeding, all the things we just talked about, the exact species you're actually dealing with, those sorts of things are pretty useful. And again, from a more strategic perspective, some of the radio tracking information can be very useful for that context. And the guidelines basically say, look, landscape schemes, high impact, rarer species, this is the sort of thing that you should be doing. There are some cons, and the primary one really is the welfare of the bat, because you are, unlike acoustic surveys, you are messing around with the bat for at least a couple of hours or an hour or so while you've captured it and you're tagging it or whatever you're doing. And then, of course, it's going to potentially have to carry a transmitter for a couple of weeks. You're coming into contact with bats. You've got things like rabies, so the welfare of the surveyor. Also, to get the best out of the data, I'm quite big on people actually spending lots of time in the field at night. So dusk dawn surveys are dusk to dawn, not dusk and dawn. Dusk to dawn surveys, pretty commonplace in our organisation, because we want to get that information through the night. And it's amazing what bats do in the middle and later at the night, not just the first couple of hours after dark. It takes a lot of competence and training to be good at this, and I guess to do it commercially, it's a lot more pressure. It's a very different set of pressures to actually catch the bat. And it's not just the catching the bat, and often people focus on getting their class 3 and 4 license. It's actually designing the surveys. How many bats do you need to tag? For instance, to answer the questions you need to answer. How many nights do you need to radio track? That sort of thing. Do you use this lure? Do you use that lure? Cool. So there's a whole range of things there about design. Obviously, as the field surveys, make sure you're safe yourself, safe for the bats. And then after that, it's what does all the data mean? So it's not just the field work, which again, people focus on. And like I said earlier, it's the need to catch the bats is quite a bit of pressure that's slightly different. So this helicopter is starting up. So you'll have to forgive me if I get drowned out. The other thing I'd say is that the squeaky wheel syndrome is quite an issue, because people tend to focus on the specific data. And I put the received cost, but that should be perceived cost, but I've had a couple of late nights. Okay, finally, you need a lot of kit too. So I've got some case studies, but actually this guy could be 5-10 minutes starting up, Harry. So I wonder if I perhaps leave that there and then come back to some of those case studies a bit later, because I think he's going to
Sounds a good idea. Richard, would you mind kicking in for your bit, and then we'll jump back to Ian's case studies whilst he sorted his helicopter out? Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, let's do this.
Is that all right? Fabulous. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being flexible. So yeah, hand over to Richard with his awesome backdrop. I do like your backdrop.
Oh, well, I haven't got any helicopters. I've got
yeah. So sorry about that. There's 2 of them as well, but one's starting up now, and I don't know whether he's going to do a ground run or whatever. But they work for the Department of Conservation. They're sort of dumping off traps and things into the bush. So yeah, sorry about that.
No worries, Ian. Well, we'll kick over to Richard. Richard's ready to go. I think he's nearly ready to go. So all looks good from your end. And then yeah, and what we'll do, we'll come back to your case studies, and then we'll go for questions after you presented your case studies. Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Okay. Can you see the screen okay?
We can. We can see your excellent.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm sorry, can't see you. It's always a little bit strange online, but I think we've got a large number of people here, which is quite exciting. Nice to actually have the opportunity to kind of review this, because of course the 4th edition guidelines came in, I think it was September of 2023. Was it 23 now? God, forgetting myself already. It's actually launched on the 15th of September in 2023. So we've actually had kind of that's not 1 year on, it's 2 years on, isn't it, really? We've had a proper bedding in session now, so we can really get a feel for what the guidelines can do. And it does take time to work out what works and what doesn't within a document, you know. And I think despite my slightly sensationalist title there, I think firstly, of course, these are just my own opinions on this, and I've to some extent, like Ian, we've got a degree of responsibility to this as well. We were involved putting this together, but these things are, of course, designed by committee, and so you know there's not always consensus on individual topics. There's sometimes things that you would never imagine that take inordinate amounts of time to get any kind of agreement on. Some things you feel that you're never going to get them over the line, but it's an important process. It's remarkably diplomatic. I have to say, I think Jan at BCT did a splendid job again, pulling all the different views together, because at times they were diverse, you know. And I think the other thing that's important to say is that it's a bit like modeling biological data. It's never perfect doing a guideline, but it's far better than the alternative. So you just think back to the Wild West. We were just chatting before we started the webinar tonight about some of the random things that people used to do, and the very small amounts of survey work that used to take place before we had any of the first guidelines. First edition, of course, was in 2007, which feels like a long time ago. But I remember being in London for survey standards panel back in about 2001, 2002, and we actually spent over 40 minutes discussing the fact that it couldn't be a standard. It had to be a guideline, because there was nothing standardized about the places that bats live. So yeah, think back to the wild west. I was also remembering that my own trainer and mentor, I suppose, Tom McCowett, I remember once sharing a train journey to BCT in London, and he was just discussing that these things over time swing back and forth like a pendulum, a bit like politics. And they tend to rock from side to side, and some things come into favor and some things go out of favor. And I think it's good to remember that that there is that tendency that sometimes somebody will feel that something needs tightening up, and sometimes it will be relaxed a little bit. And of course, the other big thing I think, which is really pertinent and has certainly really ignited my enthusiasm for trying to get the word out there, I suppose, is the very rapid acceleration of technology, both through machine learning and artificial intelligence, through to physical development of devices and things. And I think it's affecting very many facets of the work that we do. But also, I think it's very hard to stay up to date with it all. And so that's something I've been dedicating quite a lot of time to over the past couple of years. And I'll mention some of that as we go along as well. So I'm going to have a little reflection on what we've done. And it's a bit cruel to call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, really. It's not that bad, but I suppose it's nice to look at it with a smile as well. So some of the things I'm very pleased about, I'm personally delighted. I think I want this chiseled on my epitaph, that we're doing less dawn surveys. It doesn't mean you can't do dawn surveys, but I think in terms of the bog standard routine bat surveys that are taking place by the hundreds every night through the survey season, people are now using equipment, which means they can see what's going on. And in many cases, that means they don't need to go out and do those dawn surveys. I was really pleased that Ian just mentioned the dawn to dusk, because I sort of think that's next best. I sort of think if you can't get what you need to know off a dusk survey, then the next approach is to go out all night. And actually, I've even done this on some large and complex buildings, often on my own or just with one other colleague. And you just find such a lot more about how the bats are using a space in between time, which of course, and this is going to be a theme for me today, is focusing on what's the outcome? What's all this for? And I think that's something which I think we've lost sight of. And reading between the lines, I think there are people in government that think we've lost sight of as well, a little bit. And so I think we need to tune into it. I think we're in defensive mode at the moment, rightly so. You've, I'm sure, all heard me speak defensively on the subject, particularly regarding the planning and infrastructure bill. There's clearly a lot wrong with that, but there are elements of the drivers behind that which I think are justified and need some investigation. I think we're not being as effective and as efficient as perhaps we need to be in some sectors. So I think we need to do a little bit of introspective work to think about, are we getting the best out of this? And personally, I really see a very strong role for technology in this. So I like the fact that we're doing fewer dawns. I think it's creating a safer environment. I think in many respects it's more efficient. In most cases, there's certainly no research to suggest that it would be a different bat coming out of a building to going back in. And from the relatively small amount, but there is some of the research is better than others. Varies across the species. Includes some research by Ian as well. For the emergence and re-entry times, which goes back to a paper that Henry Andrews first produced, there's certainly a very strong case for saying that if you're looking at particularly built structures, the 90-minute dusk emergence survey is going to be pretty reliable. You're going to get the vast majority of bats during that period. And that's not a surprise, because bats are going to be hungry. They've been in there all day. They're going to want to get out. But the return to roost time is far more varied. And what we realised is that the standard, what was happening in the second, third edition guidelines, stood a fairly high chance of missing quite a number of bats. And there's a bit of, what would you call it? Is it cognitive dissonance? I'm not sure. Because we've all seen amazing dawn swarms, and I think they tend to outweigh, because they're such a spectacle and they stick in our minds so much, they tend to outweigh the very many surveys that you've done where you just get the single pip, but you don't know what happened when you were still in the travel lodge or the Premier Inn or sleeping in the back of the car or whatever it was 2 hours previously or 2.5 hours previously. And many of those bats may well have already gone back in the roost before you even got back to site in the morning. And of course, also through the use of technology, we're starting to get excellent things like, I think some of you will have seen the brilliant videos that Jim Mulholland's put online. I thoroughly recommend his YouTube channel. And we just start to see the amount of activity from a whole range of species that's impacting bats. And something that I've taken away from that, something I've suspected from a long time, but particularly using the reflex cameras and some of these higher spec trail cameras. And some of you may have seen the interactions with the squirrel and the nocturnal bat, the ongoing saga. It's better than TV. But also the very many other species that are visiting these roost holes in the trees. And you realize, I put a post on LinkedIn a week or two ago, and I just said, to be in nature is to be disturbed. And I think we're possibly overly cautious about disturbance, for example. And I only say that in terms of, is there, are we making enemies unnecessarily? I think there's a time and a place. I stopped a job just the other day and said, no, sorry, the bats are there. You're going to have to wait. I'm quite content in doing that, but I think we need to do that in an informed way and make sure that we're not being overly cautious unless it's justified. So I think always being mindful of enabling whenever it's possible. Fewer transects. I think there was a pretty strong feeling on the board that that transects weren't as useful as were perhaps indicated by earlier editions of the guidelines. There were certainly certain parties within the panel that were reluctant to get rid of that entirely. Now, you might say that the nighttime bat walkovers is a sort of unhappy compromise, but I think it's achieved what we need to achieve in terms of getting consensus with the panel. I think there was a risk of a deadlock otherwise. And it's got to be diplomatic. And, you know, I think those of you that perhaps watched the political negotiations for the planning and infrastructure bill and the way they've been batting it back between the Lords and the Commons, you get an appreciation for how the negotiation works. And I'm not quite going to say that we had to negotiate in quite that way for the guidelines, but there are certainly different opinions and some very strong opinions, and of course lots of different experiences that influence that. So I think it's really important. This is a little snapshot from my friend Giles at Co-Ecology. This is one of the things I've really enjoyed in the last 18 months. So within the lifetime of these guidelines, is the use of the thermal drone. And I think it's a really exciting technology. And like all things, it's not the tool for every job. I'm not going to go out and buy one. I've no plans to go out and buy one. But I'm very pleased I know a few people that are skilled in the use, and that we've been able to test the approach. We've got proof of concept. We've got some robust analysis. It just works on large complex structures, terribly effective. And I think it's it's one of those things that I'm really pleased to see where the different technologies being combined to give us some of these excellent results. The optimum surveys, I was personally, it was not something that I drove, but actually introducing a slightly longer wait between surveys, I know isn't politically popular and isn't commercially popular, but I think from an ecological perspective, I think it gives a far more robust picture of behavior, and so I think it's from my perspective, I would never have just done two weeks apart for more than 2 surveys, unless there was something very unusual going on. Because I think it all gets too compressed. To be honest, I think there's big question marks over really the whole year. I think Ian just touched on it before. What are we dealing with in the shoulder seasons, the spring and the autumn period? They can be terribly important in some senses. Project I was discussing today, they ended up doing a late survey in September because the client said, well, can you just find out something just to enable them to get a feel for what was going on the site and whether it's going to be viable. And they found mating barbastels, and that wouldn't have happened had they stopped and done the surveys within the normal period. So there's definitely things that we're missing. I don't want this to be interpreted as me saying, oh, we need to be doing early spring and autumn surveys as well. But I think we need to use our budget in the broadest sense of the term, our survey budget, as effectively as possible. I think that's really important, and that will at times mean visits at other time of year, and quite possibly by removing one during the summer. Maybe you only do 1 or 2 visits in the summer and add in an autumn visit. I think that's something that we probably should consider from time to time. I'm a huge fan of long-term static data, particularly for structures, because you get that temporal information. You find out what the bats are doing. Are they just visiting during the night? Are they visiting regularly during the night? Do they stay for long, or are they just popping in for a couple of minutes? All of this sort of stuff, and it's something which I find often fills in the gaps that other techniques leave, and it's relatively cheap to do. And I do a lot of automated analysis. I use the BTO acoustic pipeline a lot. As Ian said, if you're just going to lump the meiotis together anyway, if you're just getting a picture of activity, and you can get your specifics from other sources, then that's something that I'm pretty comfortable with. And I'll talk about the use of automated analysis in a slide or two's time. There's been a lot of fun playing with the different gadgets and putting infrared and thermal side by side. I've done a lot of testing on this now, and I'm pretty comfortable saying that I think most people are likely to migrate to the thermal over time when presence absence is the primary aim. That's not to say that you should stop using infrared. I'm certainly not going to be selling my infrared cameras. You get different information. It's very difficult to identify a species, for example, on a thermal. And actually, in this very scenario just here, this was a Ceratine maternity roost that we picked up by radio tracking. Actually, whilst the thermal scope probably did the best job of all, the night fox whisker in that situation actually did a perfectly good job. Interestingly, it behaved better than I expected. It's not a device I'd perhaps naturally turn to quickly, but again, I think we've got to go back to the Wild West times of how far we've come on, and if it's enabling us to see in the dark, then that's a huge leap forward as far as I'm concerned. We've come such a long way. I should mention actually that the night vision aid guidance is still coming along. It has been a slow process, and it's very much been upset by the planning and infrastructure bill and various other things as well. But in fact, there's a meeting, I think early next week, with a view to try and pull that document together. So that's still on the way, but I think most people have really got their head around it to a large extent now, and getting much better quality results. So some of the bad things that I see, some of the I had to fish a little bit for this. I don't really want to be too critical about it, but hibernation is, to me, I think, the elephant in the room. We're now made to do hibernation surveys if there's any potential. I'd love to know how much people are actually finding bats, because I think poking around with an endoscope in the winter, you might encounter a bat. I have in my career in winter, possibly in 26 years, probably found a bat in the winter unexpectedly twice. So I'm not convinced that's a great use of time and client money and potentially delay. I think it's another one of those things that risks causing more upset than the benefits provide. Static detectors is something I like a lot more, but again, there can then be that problem of actually working out what does that mean. There's been a bat flying in here. Can you actually confidently extrapolate that to mean that the bat is residing in there over winter? So that's something to think about. I'll come on to hibernation again in a second. The weather stations thing, I think we managed to get that addressed with the update. That was I'm not sure if there was just a drafting error or something in the original PDF version, but I think we're pretty clear that the weather stations are only needed for larger scale projects now. Personally, I'm not even convinced that the need for that. I think we've got pretty good weather recording in this country, local enough. You can make observations if there's local conditions that are likely to be different, would be my view. But again, don't forget, when you've got a guideline, you've got design by committee, and you have to appease all the people present. Some of the process and protocol things, use of accredited agents is something that's quite complicated. I see there's just been a notification that they're going to try and transition people from the BAT mitigation class license, the low impact license, into level 1 of the BAT earned recognition scheme. The earned recognition scheme, I think, there may well be some questions on this. On paper, I think it's great. I think in practice, having now used it for, I think, just coming up on 20 sites, it does actually work. There's a few things I don't particularly love about it, but that's partly because I dislike bureaucracy and paperwork. So some of that's unavoidable. I'm quite I'm not going to lie about that. And I think the application process has still got a little way to go, I suspect, from some of the accounts that I've had. But I think overall, I think the concept is sound. I like the idea that we should be able to train people and accredit them to a point that they can do increasing amounts of work themselves without having to go back to ask for permission or to get a sign off. I sort of think that's the future. It's a little bit like the olden days, when we used to go and do roost visits, and then we'd write a form, and then the statutory body, whether it be it was English Nature or Countryside Council for Wales or whatever, would then basically just write a letter endorsing the information that you'd put on the form in many cases, and it was sort of a rubber stamping process. I think that's the way you describe it. And earned recognition, well, it feels like that so far. I've had very few queries on some quite complex jobs that I've done multiple species jobs with as many as 18 roosts on a couple of them, and species including horseshoe bats hibernating in maternity, and Barbastelle and grey long-eared bats, so quite a nice range of species. And I'm certainly finding that the process of that is working very well. I think I'm still having nightmares about the application process and the challenges of pulling my experience log together. That was quite something. So we need to drill down on what's really needed there. Yeah, I think I would raise the question as to whether what we're currently doing for the winter surveys is actually giving us the information we need, or should we, as the bat mitigation guidelines suggest, make a greater degree of assumption. And tying into that, there's also this challenge which came out recently. There's this applies to Natural England, the wildlife licensing newsletter from September, which slightly conflicts with the bat mitigation guidelines, because they're taking a more precautionary approach where there's a risk of hibernation, and if it's anything other than negligible, they're asking us to avoid the winter period. Now, an awful lot of the projects I work on or help people with are large, complex, and heritage projects. And basically, if you've given April and October as your periods when most of these things, of course, they have some likelihood of hibernation. And in many cases, your hibernation surveys might not tell you very much, because finding hibernating bats is very difficult. And if you use a static in a complex site, you're always going to have bats. They're always there. But you don't know if they're flying through from a different roof or something like that. But having just 2 periods of 4 weeks to re-roof is extremely limiting. And particularly that they're not also very keen on us starting on maternity roosts until the beginning of October. That's been a cause for some considerable frustration on a few projects that I've worked on. In my experience, having done this for a long time, more than 25 years, and I've always, particularly in Wales, always started on the 1st of September. And occasionally you meet the odd bat, but it's a bat in good condition. It's a bat, ready to move on. They're always volant. You don't have pregnant females and that sort of thing. And importantly, it gives you a long enough window to get the works finished before the really cold conditions start. The problem with starting in October is by the time the scaffolder's not turned up, the builder's wife's had a baby, or whatever it happens to be, you suddenly find that the roof's off in December, the family's got no roof on their house, and you're just wondering, well, if the bats are there, they're now not in a frost-free zone, they're now in a sub-zero temperature potentially. Whereas if we could have started that a month earlier, then that possibly could have been avoided. So and I've not had much luck negotiating my way out of that by more than about 9 days. 21st of September has been the earliest I've kind of managed to negotiate so far. So that's I find that not terribly logical. I have to say that doesn't chime with my experience very well. I don't get to talk anymore about the weather stations. It's a pretty small thing and really very well addressed by the update document. Accredited agents on surveys, I think that made sense. I think that there should be a licensed person. I mean, a license is never intended to be a measure of competency, really, but it's kind of the best we've got at the moment. Again, perhaps that signposts to something else. I must confess, found myself with a lot of these documents that I've been involved helping to put together or just providing case studies for or whatever, increasingly find myself saying, well, if we just trained everybody properly, we wouldn't need all these big complex documents because everybody would understand what's needed. But there's very little appetite for an accredited training process, which I think is a shame. And I don't just say that because I make money out of it. I actually make very little money out of training these days. It's just something that I think would lead to much higher standards overall if we could get a much more standardized basic training syllabus. And I think then we could lean on people better. I think we could do more. We could simplify the licensing process even further. We could trust people. We wouldn't need to be bringing in new permits to disturb bats. We could actually be assuming that people have got the skills and the knowledge to be able to supervise those without needing to issue a permit. So I use regulator in the broadest sense here. I think there's problems. We know about the asset stripping of the government agencies and of local authorities. The fact that many local authorities don't have direct access to ecological support and that sort of thing, which makes it very difficult. I think there's some things we can do to help that. And to try and keep things as proportionate as possible. Proportionality is a really, really big and important thing for me. Spend time as consultants explaining and justifying what we do. I think that's a comment I get a lot from projects I've gone into where there's a stalemate. It's that the regulator, whoever it may be, can't understand what's been proposed, or more often how somebody's jumped from a set of survey results to a particular mitigation outcome. So I think that's really important. And then, of course, not forgetting that they're guidelines and it's not a standard. And I think sometimes we do need to remind our regulator friends that there's nowhere does it say you have to do 3 surveys. And sometimes you'll perfectly well get the information you need off a daytime PRA and a single desk survey. And arguably, sometimes you may even not need that. And we've got good examples of emergency jobs done under licensing policy 4 with an excellent outcome. Where there were no nighttime surveys done because it was urgent. And so I think, again, we should be self-interrogating whether we're always just doing it because it's a shopping list. Thoroughly recommend getting hold of Paula Reason's lecture that BCT put on, was it last week, titled A Voice of Reason. It's available, I checked earlier, on the BCT Learning site. I think you can get it for a tenner. That's a very well spent £10 to listen to Paula's experience over. I think she's just hit 30 years of this, so I think she feels she's got some right and makes some brilliant points. I heartily recommend that. Some of the ugly then, there's a bit of a terminology overload in it. There's all sorts of things in there. Very difficult for clients. It's something I've noticed in reports that I've reviewed recently. Do make sure you always spell them out, or have an appendix which explains what they all mean. But ideally, spell them out the first time you use them in a report. It does make things difficult for our non-ecologist friends, especially. There is the tree dilemma. I don't really want to go into that in any great detail. I'll just cover it very briefly now. And there's also this business of process versus the ecology, and its thinking is that are your surveys actually focused on what the outcome is? I'm just going to skip across that one because I'm just a bit conscious of time. I want to just very briefly talk on trees and the concept of the roost resource. I think this is absolutely what we need to be thinking about, but it doesn't chime with our current interpretation of the legislation, particularly the Habitats Directive. So I think it's important. There's some frustrations around the tree chapter. I wasn't able to be involved in that chapter, unfortunately. And so I think the concepts behind it are sound enough, but I think the way it's implemented, it hasn't quite worked. All I'd say is that it is still a guideline, and so if you want to put additional categories in, you can do so, and I'd recommend that you do if you don't feel comfortable with the PRFI and the PRFM. Just insert your own. You can still keep those, but you can work around them. And I think do that on a client-led basis according to what a particular impact requires. MVAs. I mean, I think everybody's pretty much got a fairly good idea. I think I'd always say get the best kit you can. Focus particularly on the cost of analysis. Is almost the biggest thing. The cost of the hardware is almost, I want to say, almost irrelevant, because you spend far more in the actual analysis time, and the higher quality equipment you've got, the faster you'll be able to analyze it. And if you're going to attempt to use some of the auto analysis approaches, of which there are a few out there and several more about to hit the market, I think, just make sure you critically review them, and just the same way that you would if using auto analysis for your acoustics, for your back calls. And I think it's absolutely got a place. It's not going to be perfect all of the time, but neither is doing it manually, you know. So find the right process, review it with a critical mind, present your workings. You know, I've often suggested to people that they put a small paper together, small white paper. It doesn't need to be published, but it can just go as a, we've analysed all of our results. We've done some side-by-side comparison with a manual analysis and an automated analysis. And this is what we found. You know, this one was better in certain situations, that was better in other situations. But actually present your results and show how effective it is. And if there's an error rate, that's almost always going to be acceptable. Just say what your error rate is. Top tip there. I've picked up a few sites where people weren't recording many bats, and it's because the bat detector was clipped to the tripod with the camera or the thermal scope. And because you're trying to get as much field of view for the camera in, it's had the result that the bat detector is too far away from the emerging bats, so it's not picking them up. So I think I remember quizzing that, but not being able to put my finger on why when I saw the draft of the guideline. And of course, it does make sense. I don't think they necessarily need to be paired. I know some people like to line them up and put a soundtrack to their analysis, but I think so long as you've got a perimeter of detectors around your structure, tree or structure, then I think that's okay. And again, just explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And your bat detector probably needs to be closer than your camera. And just coming to the end, really, just focus on the outcome. A few times I've used the analogy that we're ending up spending perhaps as much as £10,000 doing surveys and preparing licenses and supervising work, and then the outcome is a couple of £100 of the bat boxes or something. And that's a messed up system. That's not getting a good result for bats. That's just paying for some salaries and it's not what we're here for. So I think we need to be a bit careful about that. And I think the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is going to force us to be more critical. I would argue it's a bit late. We should have thought about it sooner. But again, have a listen to Paola's talk. It's quite on the money on that point. So a year on, I think you know, we've learned some lessons from it. It's a guideline. It's never going to be perfect. We got consensus. There were things I thought we were never going to get consensus on. So I think it made the best job of what was available at the time. Keep it intelligent, keep it informed, and show your working, as your maths teacher used to say at school. Show your working so they understand how you're arriving at conclusions. That's really important. That's still the thing I see the most in reports, is that it's very difficult to see what the link between the survey results and the recommendations or the requirements for mitigation are. That's often quite difficult. The interpretation is often lacking. Yeah, and I think there's not really much else to say. They'd be proportionate, species-led, and designed for the mitigation. Yeah. Can't help but put in a mention of the expo. Please do book on. We've got quite a lot. I think we've sold a third of the tickets or something, but make an excellent Christmas present, by the way. So we hope to see as many of you as possible, 18th and 19th of March. And as I think Harry mentioned at the beginning, also keep an eye out, because there'll be another SIEM Planning and Infrastructure Bill briefing and panel session. I'm afraid you might have to listen to me again. First week in January. So keep an eye out. The date's not been firmed up yet, but there we are. I think we'd better do some questions now.
We're going to go back to Ian just quickly to do case studies.
Yeah,
his helicopter interrupted his case studies. Yeah, and then we'll come back to questions. So if you can do 5-6 minutes on your case studies, and then we'll whiz back. I'm just conscious of the time. That'll be hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, and look, just excellent stuff, Richard. Thank you. A lot of synergy with my own thinking there. So look, just couple of case studies, well, more than a couple, but let's see. So firstly, strategic planning. So here's a project that we did with actually this group of people here. So we actually did this year. So this is hot off the press. The report's sort of been drafted with the New Forest, but they're quite keen for me to talk about it. So this is a greater horseshoe bat population that occurs in Hampshire. There's been a roost I used to monitor way back in the 90s, early 2000s, and then since I moved away, bat groups taken over, and it was never really used during the summer. There was like one male hanging around in there in summer. There's a lot of development in the Avon Valley, and the problem, of course, is that the survey guidelines are talking about doing the surveys from May through to sort of September, October, and of course, the bats aren't really there. So how do you deal with that? Well, advanced surveys help with this, and they wanted the information to help really understand how the bats use in the area. So the little purple lines here on the left picture there, that's all the core areas of the bats, and the sort of smaller, areas that they're using. But the red lines are their home ranges, and as you can see, some of these bats actually towards the end of our survey session, which took place in April into May, went as far as Blandford, 30 kilometers away, and then stayed there because that's where there's a maternity roost. And there was another one just not about 13 kilometers away. So you can see some of the problems with dealing with bats when you're just focused on a red line. That's probably the message I'm going to say there. And there's some good examples actually of how supplementary planning guidance has been used to help people locally. So it's not just about the bat survey guidelines. I encourage regional areas and others to develop their own guidelines. Even, to be honest, just a couple of pages of A4 of what expectations might be, because there's a lot of local information that can go in there. Because that approach with the Greater Horseshoe Hampshire wouldn't apply everywhere, but it would apply in certain parts of the country. Even something as basic as a trapping survey. So Eastleigh Borough Council asked us back 10 years ago to look at all the woodlands in their borough and trap all the bats. We came up with a species list. We found a Bechsteins and we found a Barbastells. They're just males. It's quite an urban borough on the whole. So, but it was something then for them to consider as part of their local plan, which they do now. So here's more of a nitty-gritty one. This is live at the moment. Project we've been working on the last few years in Sussex, not far from Crawley. And they want to put 3,000 homes to the west there. And Daniel Whitby did some work on this a bit earlier, and he found some Bechstein's bats. We followed it up, and we effectively had to work out what the bats were doing there. So again, Bechstein's, static loggers, not really good for those. Lots of tree roosts. Again, you're going to sort of survey every single tree in a woodland to try and find a Bechstein's that's probably moving behind you. And so radio tracking, that sort of thing, really useful. We did some surveys in 22 and 24. So we ended up doing 2 blocks of 2 weeks. So we had 2 weeks and then another 2 weeks each season. So it's had a total of 8 weeks of survey. We ended up tagging 16 Bechsteins, and we got full home ranges for those bats. And this is just what we looked at. And so this is just an example, a snapshot from 24. You can see the red line there, part of the red line covered by these, what we call minimum convex polygons. So they're sort of home ranges, a lot of activity down here. But actually, when we looked at their core areas, this is actually where they spent most of the time. We had a maternity population to the south here and a maternity population up here, completely separate. Now, most of the development has to go in half that red line, the lower half of the red line, because of Gatwick Airport. So all this has to be for various safety reasons, can't be full of things. So there's lots of opportunities, BNG, all that kind of stuff. And that's what the information has been used for. And when we looked at the roosts, actually, there was hardly any roosts on site. I mean, there were a few that were found in previous years, but all the big maternity roosts and Bechstein's roosts were actually located way further south. And I hate to say it, already under a lot of development pressure. I just don't know how you'd have got that information if you hadn't been doing radio tracking. It's just impossible. So that context is really critical to making decisions over these developments. And yeah, I'll probably just whiz through some of those. And we've got Richard mentioned it briefly about this roost resource approach. So Sizewell C, we've been working on that for the last sort of 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years. And that led to a license. It already had, I helped with the development consent order, with the approach to roost resource. But as you can see here, most of the development's going in the middle there, and the majority of roosts have been avoided. So the roosts that were there were roosts within the centre, but this is mainly coniferous forest here. And so we were picking up day roosts and a few maternity roosts of the more common species. But the barbastels here, for instance, by and large, left alone. And we got a license to deal with that, and we're still working on that now. Most of the clearance is done. The monitoring that we've been doing has shown there's been very little effect on the bats overall. So there have been some minor changes, but there's nothing significant from the stats we've done on it, which is great. And then I'll probably leave you with this one. This is the tale of two surveys. So again, as part of Sizewell, they have these other schemes that are associated with it, called offsite infrastructure or additional development sites. And there were two road schemes as part of this. One was about 3K long, one was 7K long, known as Two Village Bypass and Sizewell Link Road. And this is a real opportunity where we got to compare advanced surveys, which the Two Village Bypass got, mainly because our monitoring there had picked up quite a lot of barbastel activity. So we thought we'd better look at that differently. And the Sizewell Link Road, which again, was a bit more rural. It's less woodlands, although there's fair few woodlands either side of the scheme. Again, the routes had been designed to avoid most of those, but they were basically trimming some woodlands and going through quite a few tree lines and hedgerows and things like that. Hundreds of trees on either one that were going to be affected. And this was the output we got. So again, we did in 24, we did 4-week survey on a Two Village Bypass, and we got 35 roosts, a load of 3 new barbastel populations that hadn't been found about, and a whole bunch of maternity populations of long-eared Stolbentons, Natterers, all adjacent and crossing the scheme. For the other one, although this is just one map, we got lots and lots of maps like this, effectively looking at single trees within the red line and color-coded them, negligible, PRFI, PRFM, all that kind of stuff. And we did actually find 16 day roosts of common species, mainly pips and natterers, and that sort of thing, and some long-eareds. So that was effectively the difference between the two in terms of the results. So looking left, strategic landscape ecology approach. This was completely accepted, although we didn't survey all the trees. We've done some previous tree climbing in the previous years just to sort of look at what the resource was. But this was perfectly accepted under my woodland annex under accreditation level 3. This is very much a red line PRF inspection focus approach. I would argue a bit like an asbestos management approach, which a lot of survey, perhaps different outcome. It was still accepted by Natural England. It followed the guidelines, but fundamentally two very different outcomes in terms of data and context. Cost. Well, the advanced surveys is 25% the cost of the standard surveys. Simple as that. And they were far easier to manage. And although a lot of people think advanced surveys are more expensive, they're really not when you start getting over 100 trees affected. It's a completely different ball game. You actually make huge savings. You get better information. So, and then I did say finally, but this is actually the final one. We just did some work. We used the roost resource approach here. We managed to get a license again from Natural England and the Trees and Woodland Annex, and we're checking trees before they're felled in areas which are a high risk to the public because of ash dieback. And for that one, this was a real mix of information from professional consultants who've been looking at the trees and been doing some misnetting surveys. The back group had been involved as well on this one to get some of the information, and the own ecology service. So I wouldn't say necessarily this had the same sort of level of attention as some of the infrastructure projects because it's more of a land management safety issue. We still got data, but we also relied on LP4, licensing policy 4, to help us deal with this particular issue. And Natural England approved it. Right. Was that 7 minutes, Harry?
It does help if you unmute yourself, doesn't it, when you're talking? Thank you very, very much. It is indeed time for questions. So if you do have questions, please feel free, stick them in the chat, put your hand up, and we will go through the questions that we've got. So I'm going to pick up the first questions. We've got some questions that have come in on the chat now. So I'll go to the first one that's come in from, I think it's Katie P. Katie says, what do you think about the view of some ecologists on the need for a surveyor to stand next to the camera With good equipment, I don't see that this is necessary since the footage is so good and the bats we see on the videos aren't ones we would see BLE, for example, especially those that don't echolocate. Also can check and recheck. What are your thoughts on that, guys? Probably both of you have got an opinion on that.
I think it's nonsense. I think it's completely bonkers. I think if you've got a high-spec piece of equipment, why would you put a person next to it? I mean, I've been persuaded that there's an argument, particularly in small consultancies, that they're actually doing some of the review live. I'm okay with that. It's not how I do it, personally, because I think, you know, one of the benefits of a recorded output is that you can pause it and you don't get distracted. So you've got a recording, you can slow it down, you can go back over it. I don't see how you can get such a good output by reviewing it live, but I can see that it's expedient to do it that way in certain circumstances, and it's still 100 times better than not using any MVAs. So I just don't get why you'd necessarily put a person with it. I think I view it that you have enough surveyors on site to make sure your kit doesn't get nicked.
That's what I was going to say. That's my thought. If stopping it getting nicked or eaten,
and I think those people should still have a bat detector. They should still be alert to bats. I think they should be observing the peripheral activity, what's out of the shot of the camera. But I don't see any sense personally in putting.
That's why we've got the kit and the technology, which is improving all the time.
And also, it's a moot point because everything's going to be analysed by AI within 2 or 3 years anyway. It's predictable, it's repeatable. Why would a human do it? It's not great at the moment, but it's very quickly, and I mean like by the week, getting very good.
Yeah. And I mean, just for my 10 cents worth, I agree. We were using IR and the baton, remember the old bat box batons with the time expansion function to sort of feed into the IR tape. So we'd join those two up as a unit, and we might have a surveyor, sometimes two, depends on the scale of the building, who'd set 2 or 3 things. And we've been doing that for 10 to 15 years before the guidelines changed. And we never had any pushback from Natural England or others about that. And I don't know where these come from. I mean, I guess someone's had some experience, but we've not. So yeah, and we've done probably hundreds of mitigation licenses.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I mean, the only thing from my perspective is that just nosy, like to see what's happening immediately. But then, as you guys pointed out earlier, your eyesight at the time drops out. I suppose you're looking at the camera, but yeah, there we go. Just from early resource. Right, next question is from Daniel. Daniel says, if taking a resource approach for large numbers of trees impacted by project, the use of ABLAS is effective at determining summer breeding. Oh, that's a good question. How would you assess winter use for trees in licensing? It's not as if you've got some real life examples there, Ian. Winter roosts in trees can be transient and typically used by individual small numbers of bats in given trees. Is it reasonable to make assumptions of winter use of trees based on professional judgment and data from ground level tree assessments and summer ABLAS or statics? Climbing surveys are labour intensive, and is it proportionate to do climbing surveys on all trees during winter, or somewhere in the middle, i.e. survey a percentage of the trees and making a judgment from that?
Yeah, it is a good question. And if I give you just my experience and what's been accepted is we haven't done a lot of winter surveys for trees. You know, we've done a lot of summer surveys. And the advanced surveys for the scale of the project, you know, again, so you've got to think about scale and proportionality, as Richard said. You know, there'll be other surveys going on, so like static loggers and things like that. So you don't just apply one approach and sort of get the magic answer. There's a whole range of survey information that helps you with that. So going back to the actual question, no, I wouldn't insist on it. I think it depends largely on the risk and what. I mean, the problem is that the bats use the trees probably similar they do to the summer. They just sit around in the tree a lot more, maybe a few weeks, and then fly off and use another tree. And I'm glad you said winter surveys and not hibernation hibernation roosts, because you know that's that classic hibernation, and what is a hibernation tree and what's not a hibernation tree is not been determined yet, really. I think a sensible and pragmatic approach to all of that is required. And you know, the regulators and ourselves were all learning. But as Richard keeps saying, we're so much better than where we used to be.
Yeah.
You think of all the bats that have been saved because of this approach now, because every tree gets a check before it gets felled. And on Sizewell, we found 70 roosts just in that conifer plantation over a year and a half. 70 roosts. Okay, and a low roosting habitat.
Yeah.
But compared to the deciduous woodlands, still lower. So, because that's where all the maternity populations really were. There was a few in there. So anyway,
yeah, in the past we wouldn't have gone there, would we? It would have been like a forestry operation. Yeah,
yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, we've got another question
on hibernation in Bat News that came through the letterbox this morning.
Oh,
yeah.
Ooh, good plug, everyone.
Read them yet? And you arrived 2 hours.
Hot off the press. Excellent. Right. Ian, another question for you. It says, what mitigation was proposed for the roads? I'm assuming that's the size of the SLR and TVB, with all the barb activity recorded. Just curious about how habitat fragmentation was dealt with. I'll let you deal with that one then.
It's a single.
Oh, did we just lose him? Is that helicopter taking off again?
Hello, I'm back. Sorry,
yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
I was like, oh no, don't make me answer that one.
No,
yeah, go on then.
Every 10 minutes, there's a 10-second. I've almost timed it 10-second breakout. It's just the mobile network I'm on. So for that one, that was the consideration. So that had already factored into but no one really done any tree surveys associated with it. So we were doing back crossing point surveys along the existing. So we've already done the monitoring pre-fell work. So we've now done, so we had 3 seasons of data there. And that's where we got the indication, actually, there's a lot of barbs here. We better find out where they're roosting. And we've now done the monitoring. And so what we've done is we've done the monitoring since the trees have gone. And actually the pipistrelle activity has drastically declined because they're probably using the tree lines for foraging. The barb activity's slightly increased. Because the width is no more than about 50 meters. And although that for things like horseshoes and stuff like that, we're as critical as perhaps it was back in the 80s and 90s when people were really worried bats just weren't getting any consideration at all. And I suppose, bats would turn around a 10-meter gap. And there may be examples of that, but certainly our data. And for myotis bats, there's been a slight decrease, but it's not been significant. And for long-eared bats, there's been a 5 times increase in bats actually in these crossing points, crossing the gap at the moment. That's the road's not there. I'm also slightly concerned about, well, not concerned, I think it's been a great piece of work, but I'm slightly concerned about the initial idea was to put hopovers in. But Kieran O'Malley's work has shown quite clearly that if you actually put too much vegetation next to the road, a lot of bats will probably increase their collision risk. So you've got to think about these things. And we radio tracked, I was looking at there, we've radio tracked over 200 barbastels now in about 16 different counties across England over the last 20 odd years. And these bats do 10 kilometers in 10 minutes. We've timed it. They literally left the foraging area. We had someone at the roost and the bat turned up within 10 minutes, and that was 10 Ks away. They are just bombing straight across big open fields to get to where they need to. That doesn't mean connectivity is not important, particularly at emergence time and near roosts. And I think that's a different ball game because, again, we do see bats hug and stay in woodlands until it gets dark enough and then they shoot out. So hopefully that's answered your question. We're not quite sure what we're going to do with mitigation at the moment in terms of the fragmentation. It doesn't seem to have had an impact, but I want some more monitoring data before we make the final conclusion on that one. But anyway, hopefully that's answered it.
Okay, thank you. Right, Richard, a question for you. If you were a new, I don't want to say baby, that's patronizing, but a new ecologist starting out, you've got to get to grips, starting to learn about these guidelines, you want to start to implement them, start to deliver them. What's your advice? I know you've mentored a huge amount of people through your career. What would you do to recommend somebody to how to get to grips with these guidelines and understand these guidelines going forward?
There's a couple of things there. One of them is find some really good reports online. And it's quite a good process to go through, just Googling bat survey and a county or a town name or something like that. Pick somewhere batty, some of the places that Ian's mentioned with some cool species, and review some of the reports that come up. I mean, because mostly they're public domain, they're on the planning portal, and go through them. And if you've heard the names of people put their name in as well. Just use a complex Google search and pick up the reports and see how they're using it. And you'll very quickly yourself work out. It's very easy to critique reports. Writing the perfect ecology report is exceptionally difficult. But you'll very quickly pick up what makes a good report, and then you'll see how people are utilizing the strengths and weaknesses of the guidelines.
Great suggestion there. Okay, I'm just going to check if we've got any other questions. If anybody does have any other questions, please put your hand up. Have we got anything? No, nothing's come through. I'm just trying to look at the questions I got from earlier on from some of the team. Oh, again, this one's for you, Richard. In terms of, so Wales and some of the other devolved nations are starting to see a lot of upland wind farm development. Have you got any experience in implementing the guidelines with respect to upland wind farm or some of the new energy regeneration schemes, and has your approach differed?
Actually, no, I haven't. I've much more focused down on the smaller stuff for about the last 10 years. Yeah, I'm a bit out of the loop on that, so probably not the best person to ask.
Okay, no problem. And then finally, what's next for these guidelines from your perspective? Do you think we're going to see additional iterations with a change in technology, Planning Act that's going on in Wales? Do we think we just need to use them for a bit more?
Who's that to?
Either of you, I think.
Happy for you to go first.
No, go on in. You get the ball rolling.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, look, it's been 2 years. I think we need to bed in. I think that there's clearly a lot of discussion. I mean, Paola's stuff has been really, really valuable in trying to get back into a sense of proportionality. One thing I actually wanted to mention was this wonderful phrase called professional judgment. What annoys me more than anything is people using professional judgment because they don't know the answer. And they haven't got the data to back up what they're saying. And I'm still a scientist. I call it the 3 R's. I've been involved in research, regulation, because I ran licensing for English Nature for a while and done a lot of regulatory jobs. And I'm also in the real world, in that, you know, I've run a company for over 10 years, and I've got one here in New Zealand as well. And, you know, fundamentally, you know, pulling all those things together, you can say stuff, but back it up. Make sure your results match what you're saying. And I think Richard alluded to this earlier about that interpretation piece. And of course, someone with 5 years experience, his professional judgment is going to be different to someone with 25 years experience. His professional judgment, I would suggest, although quality sometimes outlasts quantity, but I'd like to think if someone's been in the game and doing a good job for that amount of time, that they may be able to see things and also be able to take more risks, you know. And that's the other thing in terms of saying, well, no, the regulators should accept this because it's perfectly rational, makes sense ecologically, it's proportionate and in line with the legislation. You know, if you can answer all those questions, then there's no reason. But as we all know, clients can, but that perpetuates.
Oh, we got a 10-second cutout then. Whilst we're waiting for Ian to kind of click back in, I'm actually going to say thank you to both of you for joining the call this evening. Thank you, Richard. Sorry, Ian, you cut out then a second.
I know.
So I was just closing the call because I'm mindful that we're 20 past. We should have finished a few moments ago. So huge thank you to you both. Absolutely fascinating. And I know it's a topic that can go, huge amount of stuff to talk about, but you certainly it sort of whet my appetite for sort of going back to look at stuff and reminded me that bats are so cool and they're so amazing and so diverse as well. So thank you. That's really appreciated, particularly at the end of the year when we've been working on some, you know, really hard delivery projects and things like that. So massive thank you to you both as ever. Absolute stalwarts in the industry with respect to bats. And I'm sure if we get any other questions in as others listen to this conversation, or if somebody goes away this evening and thinks, oh crikey, I wish I'd asked that question, I'm sure you guys will probably be able to answer them as well. So massive thank you to the pair of you. And also huge thank you to Charlotte, who organised these sessions on the Welsh Committee, and to Mandy and Alice from the Secretariat for facilitating everything this evening. Massive thank you. And finally, just a plug, if you have any suggested talks that you want to hear from, or may even want to present one yourself, please feel free to ask. And I think Charlotte's put some contact details in the chat. So huge thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Nadolig Llawen, and yeah, enjoy Christmas when you get there. Speak to you all soon then. Thank you.
Yeah, happy Christmas, everybody.
Cheers both. Bye-bye.